All right, and I guess we're going. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. How you doing today, dude?
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, right on.
We're thrilled. We're really thrilled.
Very thrilled. If I can keep myself in frame, and hopefully if our audio levels stay fine, then we'll get started. So, I mean, Dan and I both wanted to talk to you, I guess, about those two articles that you wrote. One, Create a Mass Party, and the other one, Revolutionary Discipline and Sobriety. So I guess we'll start with Create a Mass Party. We should say these were both for Cosmonaut Magazine, who we've both been reading for like quite some time. Very, very awesome. If any of our listeners kind of haven't checked them out, check them out. Read these two articles. They'll be linked. But I was really interested in like those two quotes that you used towards the beginning from Mao to kind of frame the question of like autonomism versus like the single party approach, the mass party. And I was just going to read a little bit of that because there's the one quote, which Mao was kind of like pulling from some old poetry, I guess, which is the let 100 flowers blossom and let 100 schools of thought contend, which like I'm from a very hippie town in California. And like I've definitely seen that on like some refrigerator magnets before in stores. And then the other quote that you use to kind of push back on that is, and I'm chopping this up a bit, but Mao said something along the lines of, ours is a great party, a correct party. The Communist Party does not fear criticism because we are Marxists. The truth is on our side, and the basic masses, the workers and the peasants, are also on our side. So I thought that was like a really great way of framing this question of autonomism versus the mass party. And I was wondering if you could kind of like explain to our viewers why that's such an important way to frame organizing and why we kind of like can't fall prey to these like many autonomist groups forming, why we kind of need to collate all of our power.
Yeah, so I guess to contextualize all of this, the Create a Mass Party article was written in response to a couple of articles that Colonizing Counterpower, which is like an autonomist, sort of councilist Marxist organization here in the United States. And so they used that quote by Mao, the let 100 schools of thought contend, 100 flowers blossom. And really, I didn't want to push back on that so much as just kind of give context to it, because they just kind of like throw it in the article and they're like, yeah, see, we got to let everybody do their own thing, you know? Whereas like really what Mao was getting at in starting the 100 Flowers campaign was we need to solicit input from the proletariat and the peasantry, and especially the intellectuals that are not yet on our side in China, and solicit their input, get their criticism, and try to make our one mass party more robust and better suited to their needs, which unfortunately ended in a disastrous failure and purges and lots of people being killed. So I'm not like putting Mao on a pedestal here. But I think although it turned out the Chinese Communist Party was unprepared for the criticism that they were going to face, I do think that that's the correct attitude to have. We should have 100 schools of thought contending within a mass party that is meant to represent, well, in their case, mostly the peasantry, but here in the United States, in the developed quarter, the proletariat and the masses.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. And I also thought you did like a really good job of like kind of framing the mass party as something that isn't like scary. You know what I mean? Because like, I feel like you explained, I mean, I don't know if you like come across anarchists and you try to explain this idea, they're like, what? Like one party? You kidding me? How's that ever going to work? It's just going to lead to a dictatorship, dude. So, I mean, like, I wonder if you could kind of speak to that too. And like the way that you framed the cadre too, I thought was very not scary.
So I guess I should say for disclosure up front that I'm taking a lot of this from Lars Lee, who is a Canadian music professor who somehow in his free time has written 800-page tomes about the Russian Revolution and about Lenin. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know he was a music professor. That's sick.
He's so cool.
One of my questions was going to be why you chose to do an audiobook reading of Lenin Rediscovered. But I sort of have the answer to that in the sense that like, he's a cool dude. Okay.
Well, yeah, these two things are heavily tied together. I am not like a representative of Cosmonaut. I'm not a decision maker there. I'm just a contributor. So up front, I'm not like speaking for them, but I would say in general, it is true that Lars Lee's conception of Lenin's thought is heavily influential on everyone that works for Cosmonaut. much including myself. And I think that he is the one who back in the early 2000s did a great job of demystifying both how like hardcore anarchists and like hardcore ML Stalinists or Trots will talk about Lenin and his ideas, and making it like less scary, because I think the textbook interpretation of Lenin's ideas is really scary. Like, like he didn't believe in the workers. He thought that we needed this dictatorial party to tell the workers what to do. And, you know, that's why everything ended up in purges and Stalin, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, Lenin was essentially just applying Kautsky's model of the SPD as close as possible to Russian conditions, which was a mass party. This was complicated by the fact that in Germany at the time, it was legal to have a socialist party, whereas under Tsarist Russia, it was not. So there was a lot of worry about how to maintain konspiracja, the fine art of not getting arrested, to a mass party model. It's hard to have both mass and underground at the same time. Anyway, I think that's where like a lot of the tension between the dictatorial party versus the mass party comes from. But yeah, overall, I would say if you dig into what Lenin's actual arguments regarding party organization were, they're a lot less scary than I think the textbook interpretation were given.
Yeah, I was just saying to Dan, I think I've gotten very good at taking Lenin out of context, especially the more that I read of like, you know, kind of cosmonaut stuff and like Lars Lee and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, wow, I've been taking him very out of context for my whole life.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that too, up until, you know, I started getting into all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just it too. It's just like, you know, it's circumstances and everything. And that's kind of not something that we can really like contextualize in our minds, or at least it's very like hard to, you know what I mean? To like put yourself in Lenin's shoes.
That's a hard task.
Yeah, exactly. So I wondered if you could speak like a little bit about the role of the cadre, because like I really did like how you managed to kind of like frame it as something that was subject to democratic discipline and taking forward the will of like the working class and like doing all of these things for them, but also while still maintaining like discipline and needing to act like at least somewhat in a relatively like centralized manner.
Yeah. I would say that's probably the most pressing task facing socialists and communists in the global north today. I think that's something that the mass party models, both, you know, in early 20th and late 19th century Europe, of like the German SPD and the Austrian Workers' Party and the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, they all did this really well. There's a number of Latin American parties today that do this really well. I don't think anyone in the United States is doing this at all. And whether we're talking about, you know, Marxist Center or DSA or, you know, any of the number of kind of bureaucratic sects or anarchist groups or whatever, this is not something we've mastered. And I think that's really should be the main priority. Demystifying it, but, you know, both in terms of we don't want to follow the like hardcore ML conception of, you know, professional revolutionaries being like the general staff of the revolution, telling everyone, you know, telling the working class what they need to do and directing things from the back. I think that this also gets into the distinction that Lee helps bring out between what a vanguard party actually is and what the myth of a vanguard party is. Because, I mean, it's a military metaphor, right? So the vanguard is the people at the front. They are not the people in the back with the generals directing everyone and telling everyone what to do. So when we say we want a vanguard party of professional revolutionary cadre, we're talking about organizers who are on the front lines of labor struggles, tenant struggles, and so on. Not people who are, you know, sitting in their armchair reading theory and handing out tasks to to people at the front. So that's, you know, what I would say a vanguard party is, what the role of the cadre and a mass/vanguard party is. You're supposed to be on the front taking direction from the workers and masses you're working with, and, you know, not bringing preconceived notions and kind of handing out tasks.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that brings me into like something else that I kind of was thinking a lot about after reading your piece, which was just like, this is a bit more historical, but Dan and I a while ago read something on the German Revolution by Reinhard Röhrup. It was just a short essay. And we kind of came away from it thinking that like a lot of the Soviets that were at least formed there were like very spontaneous, or at least I did. And it was interesting reading this and being like, the argument that was like, no, that was like, at least in Russia, there was like a lot of work for socialists to like get in there and like actually organize the working class. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I can't speak to the German experience. I haven't read on that enough to give an informed opinion, so I won't try. but yeah, I think it's very clear if you look into the history of it that the Russian Social Democratic Worker Party was instrumental in forming the Soviets, and actually the Mensheviks were doing more of that more successfully than the Bolsheviks were. Although, later, obviously, they ended up on equal footing, and then obviously the Bolsheviks won a majority later on. But yeah, they were instrumental in setting those things up. It's obvious that like trade unions, even, to some extent, like now, like tenant unions, things like that can pop up organically from the working class, but giving those things a socialist political direction is not something that's just going to happen without socialists getting involved.
Yeah, no, for sure. You made the examples of like, was it of Amazon United, Amazonians United, and of just a couple other tenants unions. But like, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, even if the spontaneous action of like the working class does bring together like or form these organizations, there does need to be like some kind of hegemony of ideas centered around Marxism.
Yeah.
For like Marxist things to happen. Like, it sounds obvious when you say it like that, but like, the implications for organizing are like big, I suppose.
And I think there's a tendency for people to see like, or view winning hegemony as like this kind of scary, sort of like authoritarian idea. And I think some people would prefer that no one has hegemony and that, everyone just kind of has their own thoughts and does their own thing. But the fact of the matter is, someone has hegemony, no matter whether it's just the political inertia of whatever the prevailing ideas are, or if it's, someone doing entryism or whatever. If socialists don't struggle for hegemony, then the default is liberals having hegemony. And, if other groups get involved and organize to win it, then they can. But we should be the ones doing that, in the labor movement and other sites of struggle.
Yeah. For sure.
And a proletarian hegemony, for want of a better phrase, would be not dictatorial, but like an affirmation of a democratic world, potentially, if it was a sufficiently mass-based party that was...
Right. As opposed to, like a bureaucratic sect doing entryism. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that I found most refreshing learning about, I suppose, maybe the sort of neo-Kautskyism or the Marxist centrism, or maybe like McNairism, as it applies to like the CPGB in the UK, is to sort of get away from this idea of the Marxist Party as the sect, because I think that's the way that I've always encountered it. It's kind of like a few people who you really question how they intend to actually affect any kind of change, kind of thing. There was another historical example I was going to bring up that you used at one point, which is of the Austrian Social Democrats, and particularly Red Vienna. I knew a little bit about that history in terms of perhaps like the history of social housing in Vienna, but beyond that, I didn't really know anything about that history. I don't know how much you can speak to it. I was wondering whether you think that's kind of like, I mean, obviously it ended relatively disastrously, but whether it represents a sort of like high watermark for the sort of mass party project, or whether you would contend with that or oppose that.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't know, it's stupid to put a number on things, but I would say like 90% of the lessons we could learn from the Austrian socialist movement prior to fascism taking power are positive lessons. There was obviously some critical errors towards the end in terms of just, not being willing to actually confront the right militarily. But I think basically everything up to that was a really, really positive example. I do think it's easy to look at what they were doing and say like, oh, well, why couldn't the Bolsheviks have just done that? Like, that was so much better and more peaceful and democratic and everything. It's like, yeah, well, they weren't in the middle of fighting like a genocidal collection of white armies and American and Japanese invaders and whatnot. So I do think it's important to remember, you know, they had much better conditions they were working with. But yeah, I mean, my interest in the Austrian movement originally came from reading Gabriel Kuhn's book. It's partially a translation of some stuff Julius Deutsch wrote, and then Gabriel Kuhn gives an introduction, I think. It's really short. It's called Anti-Fascism, Sports, and Sobriety.
I'm writing it down. A short essay is our magic word. Like, okay, it's definitely going to be an episode.
Yeah, it's delightful. And it just really goes into the connections between like these three pillars within the Austrian movement, which was the anti-fascist militias, the Republican Schutzbund, the sports leagues, which was, I think, kind of the forefront of the cultural organizations they had, and the temperance movement that the socialists had a really strong connection to. And I'm straight edge, you know, so I just have that personal bias where it's like, oh, this is fucking cool. Like, but I think that, you know, there's a lot of positive lessons there that the Austrians took really seriously, building not just a political hegemony, but a cultural hegemony, this alternative or counter culture of workers, sports, and sobriety and anti-fascism, you know, even going into like hiking and chess clubs and stuff like that. That is absolutely what we should be replicating. We have somewhat similar conditions in that we are not in the midst of a civil war right now. So we do have the opportunity to set up these cultural institutions and really build an alternative proletarian culture, which actually is the brunt of what I talked about in my first article for Cosmonaut way back in the day. That, you know, we need to take more seriously setting these things up, because I think we'd actually see a higher return on having, you know, sports and chess and hiking clubs and things like that than we would on, you know, just kind of the endless let's lobby politicians for reforms situation.
Yeah, building a culture was something I wanted to ask you about, because I've always had this idea. I've looked very rosily on that period at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, across Europe particularly, but also in this country as well, in the UK, around this culture of setting up, I don't know, like social groups and like creating not necessarily groups directed toward politics, but as you say, toward hiking or toward reading or toward various types of sport kind of thing. And I always had this idea that was a successful strategy in some ways, because there was this degree of exclusion, like the working class was excluded from a huge amount of like cultural realms, whether it was like hiking or cycling or like reading just like cultural works kind of thing. And I've always had this question as to whether, I mean, obviously something is never reproducible in exactly the same form later on in history, but I always wondered whether that was a result of a type of opportunity that doesn't exist because of the degree of exclusion, or whether, I mean, like, I was thinking about it today and realizing quite the degree of exclusion there is. So I'm already like contradicting myself perhaps, but
no, I think there's definitely
whether there's a legitimate question in there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely like a question that needs to be posed there, which is that we find ourselves in a very different situation. Whereas, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, European workers couldn't just go to the theater, you know, or see the opera, or, you know, they didn't have access to these cultural institutions. So what they ended up doing was forming their own, which then existed in militant opposition to the status quo, which was obviously very bad for the ruling class. Whereas now our ruling class has gotten a lot smarter and said, nah, fuck them. Let's inundate them with Marvel movies so that, you know, they don't need to go out and have, you know, clubs for culture, because we've got, you know, just the lowest common denominator culture right here available for them 24/7 on a nice flashy screen. So it's very different conditions to be creating cultural institutions under. On the one hand, it poses a huge issue in that it's going to be a hell of a lot harder to get people interested than it would have been back then when people were dying to have some kind of cultural output. On the other hand, it gives us the opportunity to be explicitly, you know, countercultural when we're doing these things and say, hey, you know, we're going hiking and playing chess and playing soccer and doing these things because these are things that, you know, raise our health, our level of awareness, our intellectual capacities. These are restorative activities, and they exist in direct confrontation with the sort of denigrating cultural activities that bourgeois culture presents us with. So I think there's a little more opportunity for critique and for political education and agitation, perhaps. But it's definitely going to be a struggle to just like get regular people, working people, interested in joining a weird socialist soccer club,
Yeah. I mean, real quick too. I mean, there is also opportunity for stuff, I suppose. We were just talking about this right before, but like there's an opportunity for things that capitalist structures still exclude people from that are like completely necessary for life under capitalism. And I mean, like this kind of comes down more so to education that isn't like, given to you at school, but it's like, I didn't know how to do taxes until somebody was like, do taxes. It's like what to do when you're pulled over, what to do when you're arrested. Like, I know there are kind of some examples of this in like the communist schools in California. I don't know too much about them, but I mean, I absolutely agree that like these cultural like forms need to be like made explicitly socialist, but also like there's a huge opportunity for education still that could be used for the same thing, I suppose.
Yeah, I really think we'd be wasting our time setting up cultural institutions that don't have some kind of intrinsic political education attached to it. Like here in New York, we've got a DSA like New York convention coming up in September. And I think we already have like a choir and a radio station. Those are like the two things that NYC DSA has as far as cultural orgs, but there's no like formal basis for them to exist in the rules. So there's a proposal being put forward for this convention in September that I imagine will pass because it's pretty uncontroversial, just to have a separate designation for cultural institutions as opposed to like working groups that have, like a political campaign they're working on. So one of the things I would love to do, if that passes, is, put together some kind of chess club or soccer club or something. But if I was going to do that, if I was going to have, say, like a sport club for DSA, like I'd be buying copies of Sports Anti-Fascism and Sobriety and handing them out to anyone, that showed up to play with us. That's like, there's no point if we're not gonna proselytize, and spread the good word of socialism. That's our job as socialists.
Yeah, that's always been kind of my fear. Like, why would anybody come and play on my soccer or football team as opposed when there's one, when the local pub has one, or like, I don't know, when there is some other way for people to exercise that part of their lives, I suppose.
There has to be, an intrinsic critique and at the same time, like a social fabric that they're getting plugged into. Like, you're playing soccer with some socialist people from DSA, whatever. But, when you're running into trouble with something like, I don't know, you got kicked off unemployment and you don't know how to get back on. Well, now you've got a bunch of people who like have a bunch of people on the city council that can say, hey, call this person, we'll get this taken care of for you. Like there's benefits that come with it. And then when you identify that benefit with these socialist ideas that these people are talking about, you're a lot more likely to go, oh yeah, maybe socialism is a good idea.
Go ahead. I suppose in some ways this is swinging a little bit towards your other essay on revolutionary discipline and sobriety. But I'm glad you brought up the kind of like Marvel, endless iterations of Marvel movies kind of thing. Because I really love the framing of, I suppose, things in terms of like a social disease to some extent, or like both drugs, but also like that kind of like cultural production as a kind of numbing of our existence, I suppose, or an antidote to the alienating existence of living under capitalism. And so I sort of really was quite attracted to this idea of like fixing or working on the social body and the collectivity kind of thing, and bringing people together in that way, I suppose, as a kind of like political strategy, I guess.
I found no, I mean, I found that speech by Che to the Cuban militia like just really inspiring, and it reminded me of a really short like agitational pamphlet by Kropotkin, the kind of anarcho-communist theorist, where it's called Appeal to the Young or Appeal to the Youth or something like that. Have y'all read that?
No,
it's short. I definitely recommend it. I think it's on it's short. Sorry, I don't mean to like hand out homework. Anyway, but basically, he just goes through all. He's like talking to like, I don't know what the parallel would be then, but now, like in today's terms, he'd be talking to like an 18-year-old kid just got out of high school. So it's like he's saying like, what do you want to do with your life? Like you can do this, you can do this, you can be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, you can do all these things, and he just essentially goes through each possible option, available to this young person and says like, yeah, you can be a lawyer, but, there's nothing you can do within the context of bourgeois law and order that will like necessarily change things enough to, set the working class right. And then there's a section on the doctor where he says, yeah, you can be a doctor and, you can have a house call to a slum and find some lady who's like sick in her bed because there's a factory next door that's pumping shit into the air. And what are you going to give her? What medicine are you going to give her? What medicine are you going to give her to, have a more comfortable bed to sleep on and have heating in her home and not have pollution being pumped into her lungs? Like what pill is there for that? So that's why you need to be a socialist. And that's essentially how he frames this like agitational pamphlet is like, you can do whatever you want with your life, but it's not going to make a difference unless you're a socialist and you're fighting for socialism. And it's just that speech by Che where he talks about, we're not interested in fighting individual diseases and individual patients. We're interested in, working on the entire social body. I think that those two complement each other really well.
It's a really great way to frame whenever you experience a problem in someone's life and you just want to say, but capitalism kind of thing. That's a much better way of framing that kind of like, how are you going to fix this without solving the ultimate problem kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. I suppose the other thing that I wanted to ask you about that article was there was a line that I initially thought was from you, but it's actually a quote from Krupskaya where you suggest that, what she says is that like this is we're not preaching asceticism kind of thing, but rather a joy that comes from like being part of the community and sort of like a collective joy, I suppose.
Yeah.
How would you? I suppose that article perhaps came in for quite a lot of criticism, and how would you sort of answer the charge that you're sort of demanding people like subordinate themselves to a sort of martial existence without enjoyment or?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm flattered to be confused with Krupskaya. I wish I was half the organizer or writer that she was, but yeah, that's definitely a danger, anytime you're writing something like this, where you're talking to people, like the audience for revolutionary discipline and sobriety is not like working class folks off the streets. This is aimed at people who have already taken the step to say, I am a communist, and, this is what I want to fight for. I think it's very empty to say that, if your action isn't going to back it up. And I'm certainly not demanding that everyone say that. As I said in the article, kind of defining the role of cadre, like not everyone has the capacity or the skills or whatever, to be able to dedicate their life fully to revolutionary activity. And any model that relies on getting like all or even a majority of people to do that is going to fail. Like that's why there's a distinction between rank and file members and, professional revolutionaries or cadre or whatever. So yes, on the one hand, I am asking people who are telling me I'm serious about being a communist, this is what I want to dedicate my life to. I am telling them, okay, then like you're giving some things up, you can't just be like going out and partying, drinking, doing ketamine with hipsters and, I'm sorry. You're not going to be good at organizing if that's what you're doing. And people aren't going to take you as seriously.
I only laugh because I've heard stories of similar leftists from your neck of the woods, actually.
Yeah, it's really ironic that I ended up moving to Brooklyn after writing.
I mean, in that essay, you I think you describe it as a social hell. And so when you just said you were in Brooklyn, I initially was a bit taken aback. But now I realize, I suppose you're in the perfect position to diagnose social hell if you're living in it.
Yeah, I wrote it when I didn't live here yet, and I'm definitely guilty of being like, oh yeah, Brooklyn, that's a neighborhood, right? It's all one thing. This is how it is. And I think I described like Greenpoint, Williamsburg perfectly. But like I live in like Little Caribbean. Like no one is like the people I described in that article. Everyone's like from Jamaica in my neighborhood. So obviously that does not apply to all of Brooklyn. But yeah, the Williamsburg socialist milieu is it's got some issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of just brings us on to another point of your article, which is like, I suppose this kind of relates to the cadre, but it's also just about like having role models in socialism and about how so many of them now are like debauched. I don't know. I don't want to, that's like sounds mean, but like, I don't know. I think we are reaching a point where now that the bad S word socialism and even like communism is like leaking back into the mainstream, that like we do need to bring like discipline back into it and like say that, hey, everything is political. Everything all around you is political. This is very serious. And now that like so many people are being radicalized by the like planet that we're living on is burning and, the disasters of climate change and the ticking clock of climate change as well, that like, I think that we need to like bring discipline back more than ever. And I think that it's like something that we need to like remind ourselves that this is very serious. So I appreciated that about like having some new role models perhaps in socialism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think that is not a new phenomenon. Like it goes back to the beginning. Like if Karl Marx is a personal, like hero role model of yours, like, I don't want to know you, it would have sucked to be that guy's friend, whereas, someone like, I think it's interesting too, looking at the fact that back in the day, like people were wearing like Che t-shirts and, like Che was like widely regarded as like the heroic figure of socialism. And, that was wrapped up in this idea of he was committed to self-sacrifice. He was very disciplined. And again, like, I'm not trying to say like everyone, needs to go to Bolivia and get killed by the CIA in service of socialism. Like not everyone needs to have that level of commitment, but that is, a role model that we should have. Whereas today, the role models you see, you get a lot more of the, well, if there's no dancing, it's not my revolution. And, like, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. Like, hey, like we need cultural organizations. Like we need a social fabric totally for that. But if you're so concerned about that you end up dancing on a burning planet while we all fucking die, like,
yeah,
I'm not really interested in whatever it is that you're peddling in that situation. So there needs to be a balance between discipline and, I don't know, the more autonomy oriented stuff. There needs to be.
I'm allowed to go dancing. That's allowed, is it?
Yeah, definitely. Dancing is okay for now. Just kidding.
Not uncommon.
Just kidding.
Yeah, no, that is interesting because it is like so many people, and I think this is more of like a previous generation thing, like see Marx and see communism as like this iron-fisted like world domination thing. But then there's also the like Californian ideology-esque like neoliberals in disguise, but like also have like a flower crown and like maybe take Molly every now and then, you know what I mean? So it is really interesting, like finding a like, I don't know, not like a middle ground, but like a way of saying, hey, this is really serious. We need to get serious about it. Look at how like crummy all of our lives are because of like the ills of capitalism. Here's what we're going to do about it. But also like, let's go for a hike every now and then. You know what I mean? Like healthy ways, I suppose. I think that was my main takeaway from that article.
Yeah, I think I probably picked the most controversial way to make that point too.
You name called some people.
I especially right now with all the Cuba stuff in the news, saying that Fidel Castro is the embodiment of this balance between discipline and autonomy was probably not very popular with certain people. But I think it stands. I think if you actually look at Fidel and the Cuban Communist Party's record, like the way that they handle political dissent is like well balanced between, Stalinist purges and, Allende kind of don't arm the working class, let's not have to, let's not be too ham-fisted, and then, we end up getting couped and killed. Before being in government and after being in government, I think like Fidelismo's example is a positive one, and one that we should seek to emulate. At no point did they ever try to like assassinate political rivals or, kind of shove people in a corner like that. They democratically and peacefully won political hegemony over the revolutionary movement in Cuba. And then once in power, Diaz-Canel did it too during this most recent round of protests. But there's a story in the book I referenced, Fidel's Ethic of Violence, where it was during the special period after the Soviet Union fell apart, which obviously caused huge problems for the Cuban economy, and everyone was just kind of like starving and fucked. So obviously there was a lot of protests, and Fidel's reaction to this was not to like send out police and riot gear to trample people and shoot people with rubber bullets like we have in the United States. His reaction was to walk into the crowd and start forming discussion circles, to talk to people and see what their problems were. And then Diaz-Canel did it again in this most recent round of protests that was in the news. So, yeah, I mean, like both pre and post revolution, I think that the Cubans example is probably the best one I can point to as far as this balance between discipline and autonomy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's when you just go into the crowd and you're like, so how much are you getting paid to be here? And they go, I shouldn't have said that. I think just as like another question, this doesn't have to relate to either of your articles, but I'm interested. You said that you're in Brooklyn. How is the kind of socialist/communist scene looking out there? Because I moved out to England like 3 years ago now. I don't really know much about Brooklyn, but I'm interested to know kind of like how things are looking on the ground out there.
So I just moved here a month ago, and I'm unemployed. So I've had a lot of time on my hands to try and like dig into the scene here and figure out what's going on. I'm definitely not an expert. Like I said, I just got here, but from what I can tell, there's a lot of opportunity. There's also a lot of negative trends that I think that need to be reversed. I'll make a lot of people mad saying this probably, but I think specifically in the DSA, there's a real problem where rather than the membership getting people elected into office and then, leading them to carry out the policies and reforms and fights that we want them to, it's very much the other way around. We have a lot of electoral success here, but the electeds kind of like run the show, whether directly or indirectly. If you show up to like the electoral working group meeting, it's like paid staffers of elected people that are like running these meetings. So there's very little room for any kind of dissent against whatever the electeds are doing, which I think is a big problem. And we saw this too in the most recent national DSA convention, like the resolutions that were aimed at democratic discipline, kind of disciplining elected officials to DSA membership as a whole, like those didn't pass. I doubt anything like that will pass in September at the New York convention. So that's definitely a negative trend that I would love to see, Marxists and really anyone who's interested in building a mass party that has an electoral wing that is accountable to the membership of the party. Anyone who's interested in that, I think it would be beneficial to work on that stuff. But there's also a lot of opportunities. Like I mentioned, this cultural institutions thing, like we've already got 2. We're opening up space to create a lot more. I think that's going to bring a lot of people into the movement. One thing that's really interesting here that I think is a positive example of something the electeds are doing is they're kind of hopping on this like base building idea. So we have electeds that are like actively using their office to get their constituents to form tenant unions, which is really cool.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, among other things. So there's a lot of positive stuff going on. Obviously, there's a lot of like reformism and liberalism in New York DSA, like every chapter in DSA and the national organization, but it's not like a sect where that's just how it's going to be forever. It's a battleground that we can contest as Marxists, and I think that we have an obligation to do that. It's the biggest socialist organization in the United States. It's got a lot of resources, a lot of people, and a lot of potential. So that's what I'll be focusing on, and I know some of the other people at Cosmonaut are too.
Yeah, man, that's great to hear. I mean, my experience with the DSA, like back home, have been very like, it is definitely a live battlefield, but also because I come like where I'm from, it has like a very small DSA chapter. It was also just like nobody really had any idea kind of what socialism was or what it meant. And even though it was like, I came away like feeling really, really good just because like there's just not a lot of people even using the word socialist back there. And so it was cool to like meet these people who were like at least open to ideas. But then like at the end of the day, it was all like, all right, everybody go do your job, go vote for Biden. And it was just like, all right, like, you know, these like 6 socialists in the town that I'm from, it's like, we kind of need to do a bit better. But you're absolutely right. It is totally a battleground. And I think like anyone on the left who kind of just like willing to like give up, it's like, well, there's no real point in that, is there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to get discouraged. I mean, like I've been kind of discouraged the past couple of days with some of the results from the national convention. But as socialists in the 21st century in the United States, I think it's important to realize that we've got it pretty easy, you know, compared to our historical forebears who were getting exiled and shot at and killed and tortured. And, you know, if the worst that I have to deal with is like getting creamed by some liberals at a convention, like that's... it would be pretty pathetic if I took that as an excuse to give up. So I hope that can be some tough love and some encouragement for anybody that's kind of feeling similar to the way I did a couple of days ago.
Yeah. Well, and also like 10 years ago, you know what I mean? Like I would have been in high school, but also like I couldn't have imagined that like these things were being talked about on like at least like something approaching a national stage. So, you know, it's cool.
Yeah. There's a lot of
it's cool.
Positive momentum. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, do you have anything else?
No, I think I've exhausted my list of questions.
All right, man. Well, you working on anything else? Writing anything else for any other places?
I'm taking what I feel is a well-deserved break after finishing the Lenin Rediscovered audiobook.
Yeah, no kidding.
What was that experience like? I can't imagine sitting down and reading that many words. And
it was great. I mean, I love the book. I like doing these readings. I'm like trained as an actor, so like voice acting is something I enjoy. But yeah, it's an 800-page book, you know, with the translation included. So I did like 600 of it. And the final chapter is coming out, I think, next week on all the streaming platforms. So check that out. And yeah, definitely. I mean, for anyone who's interested in all the stuff we've talked about, check out Cosmonaut in general, and anyone in DSA, check out the Marxist Unity slate, because that's an initiative that some Cosmonaut people have put together.
Right on. Well, sick, man. Thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing what else you come up with, man.
Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me.